Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Bob the Bookerer. So I started talking about all of my favourite books from February, all the books I have read in February rather, and realised that it was getting incredibly long. So I've split this into two videos. So if you haven't already, please do check out part one. But this is part two, where I talk about the others and continue to ramble at length about lots of books that I have read and mostly enjoyed. But I really hope you enjoy them. So let's go and look at what books I've been looking at. Next up, I read a collection of short stories called Milk, Blood, Heat by Dantiel Moniz. I'm really hoping I'm saying that name correctly. And it's weird, I almost in some ways can't tell you necessarily what the collection of short stories really focuses on or looks at, because they're all quite unique, but there is a real sense of malaise, particularly about the current time, that hangs over these short stories. Not only the kind of shadow of Trump, the shadow of, you know, rising violence and those kinds of things, but just a load of kind of adult characters who are just kind of lost. And I think that's what's really quite poignant about this collection, is there are just these characters who just kind of can't really get their lives together. And although that can sometimes be quite off-putting in a book, the writing is so tense and tight that this really works, that these characters are just lost and they're all kind of looking for things, whether it's meaning or belonging or, you know, a specific item, and it kind of all comes together really nicely. So I'm just really quite excited about this. I don't think it's out yet, or if it is, it's only recently come out, but I just thought it was really exciting, and again, another sort of fresh talent and some really exciting, a really exciting voice, I think, in terms of the way she writes and the way she captures characters. Next is The Death of Francis Bacon by Max Porter. So I really loved Lanny by Max Porter. And I also really liked Grief is the Thing with Feathers. The Death of Francis Bacon is quite experimental in some ways, and very, very short, actually. You know, it's really easy to read this book in about sort of 30 or 45 minutes. And as a result, you know, a lot of people have been saying it's one of those books that you actually, because it's so short, you actually do want to read it sort of 2 or 3 times, especially because of how broken up the text is in some ways. So it's all about the artist Francis Bacon, and his sort of final days, or at least he's sort of told in little vignettes, but it is essentially the idea of Francis Bacon on his deathbed going slightly delusional, perhaps, maybe is not the right word, but his sort of mental state is quite fragile, and he is really kind of diving in and out of stories and timelines and whatever. And what gets really interesting and experimental is that Max Porter himself is kind of a character in this book. At times it feels that Francis Bacon is talking directly to Max Porter, asking him not to write certain things or not to do certain things. And what you do then get is this really fragmented story in mind. This is totally one of those things that I know some people didn't really get along with. Totally fine, that makes a lot of sense. I kind of enjoyed it, but I think I also do love a little bit of an experimental read every so often. And I want to do a video coming up soon about that. Another book I'm going to be talking about, well, another 2 books I'm going to be talking about in this video are really quite experimental as well. And I just thought it was really quite beautiful, because we get this strong sense of, you know, that last sort of death urge of somebody really wanting to say their final few words and say their piece. And all of this is happening whilst Francis Bacon is in a hospital in Madrid, which is what happened in real life. He didn't speak much Spanish, or barely any, I think. And so you've got the situation where he's tired and, you know, on his last legs, in a Spanish hospital, not really able to articulate anything about himself or what he needs, or about his life, and he's just bewildered and overwhelmed, and it's really quite intense. So I think it's a really quite powerful little book, and I'm intrigued to see what happens. Part of me would be both very surprised if this did make the book a long list, because it is so short and it is so fragmented and experimental, but also sometimes that makes me think that that's exactly the kind of book that would make a book a long list, because if you're a judge and you've got to read 160 odd books, this is exactly the kind of book that I think would really stick with you. It's incredibly short, it's really quite brutal and powerful in quite a few ways. I don't think it always fully worked for me. I think there were moments for me of absolute brilliance, and then moments where I was a bit like, okay, not quite sure what I'm reading here, but I still do think it's worth checking out. And I'm intrigued if I do go and read it a second or third time to see if I have any different feelings about it. But I think there's a lot going on here that I thought was really quite special. Next up, and this is when we start getting into some of the Booker Prize books, it was going to come. I mean, I already mentioned Atonement. This is also now a period where books that I borrowed from the library ages ago that have just basically been constantly renewed by the library because of lockdown and because of library closures are now starting to rear their head where I actually need to give them back. So I've kind of abandoned a few of them for a while because I just kept on getting distracted by other shiny things, and now I've got to go back and read them. So the next few that are coming up are from the 1973 Booker Prize shortlist. So I will have a separate video coming out soon on the 1973 Booker Prize, but going through them from the ones I've read recently were The Black Prince by Iris Murdoch. So I've only ever read one other book by Iris Murdoch before, which I really enjoyed, but this I was absolutely blown away by. This is the story of an author who essentially sees some kind of act happening. He sees someone, he's sort of brought in and almost involved in a crime of someone being killed. But at the same time, we start really strongly distrusting him as an author and as the narrator of the story, because he's a bit of a failed novelist and he's kind of putting on these airs and seems incredibly jealous of this person who's had far, far more success. And then we start getting more and more indication that his side of the story isn't the right one. This is especially because we start getting right at the end of the book, there are postscripts from someone claiming to be his editor, who we never learn the name of, as well as his ex-wife, as well as somebody he falls in love with, as well as somebody who seems to fall in love with him, and it's really quite well done. I was kind of, it was one of those moments I was quite tired, but I suddenly was like, you know what, I think the last 300 or so pages of this book I read pretty much in one sitting, just because I got super, super into this, and I was really quite kind of blown away by the way it's written. It's written in this very, it sounds at first very intentionally overly formal, of kind of overly described, and at first that can feel quite off-putting, but actually once you settle into the rhythm of it, you realize that's exactly part of the thing. That's this author at the heart of it trying to retell his story in a way that frames him in a positive light. And so as a result, he's kind of almost over explaining these things because he wants to deceive us potentially. But then actually at the end of the book, we're not quite sure who's deceiving who. And for me, I really loved that. Just the fact that we get to the end of the book and you're sort of still having all these questions of, actually, is most of what I just read correct? Is it partly true? Is it not at all true? Because some of the postscripts completely disregard things that he said and say, you know, this is factually incorrect, it was actually this, but then other people corroborate it, and then you actually also think, if this person's lying, that this means this person is telling the truth. If this person's telling the truth, this other person is telling a lie, but then this other character and the narrator might also be telling the truth. So you kind of get caught in this web of lies, and I found it really quite remarkable as a book. And I am really excited to read more Iris Murdoch, and my plan is to try and read all of her Booker Prize shortlisted books this year, because I want to do a video around her birthday talking about them all. However, her books are quite long, so this was one of her shortest at about 450 pages, so you know, a few 600 pages, 600 pager kind of novels are coming, which might be a bit more difficult, but if they're all of this kind of quality, I'm not sure if I mind. So it was brilliant. The next was The Siege of Krishnapur by J.G. Farrell, who won the 1973 Booker Prize. As you'll hear when I talk about it in my separate video, I don't think this was the right winner in my choice. If it had been my choice, I don't think this book has aged particularly well. This is all about the sort of a revolt sort of during the days of the British Empire, and a revolt, particularly in India, where local people were sort of rising up against British control. And you've got these kind of characters who are warning about it happening, but these other characters who are incredibly blasé about the whole thing. For me, it doesn't always work, just because I feel it feels incredibly dated, in the sense that, I don't know, there are quite a few Indian characters who speak, but when they speak, they're given this kind of broken English, and even if that were technically accurate for the people, you know, these kind of people who are meant to be intermediaries between the British Army and sort of Indian locals, it still feels really strange that it kind of feels a little bit like they I don't know, it feels a little bit like they're being patronised through it, and I found that quite uncomfortable. And that aside, although this is critical of empire, and although it does sort of show, you know, the failings of the British in thinking that they had a right to dominate the world and kind of have an empire and enslave people, it also sort of in some ways feels like it stops before it really makes a bigger point about that. And so for me, it occasionally felt like, wow, oh, the empire's going, oh, that's really sad. Like, and it's like, no, this is and it is like, it was terrible that it happened. This is you know, anyway, it's, I could rant about that for ages, but it's for me, it kind of hit a bit of a weird point, and I'm not quite sure how I felt about it. Anyway, and then finally from that 1973 list, what is The Green Equinox by Elizabeth Mavor, which is quite different. It seems to sort of involve around these characters who are sort of all having little affairs with each other, and they're also sort of trying to stop this sort of these people cutting down trees. Quite a bizarre little novel, but very interestingly written. At times, you know, this really florid, beautiful prose, but alongside some really dark moments, and, you know, not feeling afraid to swear in quite brutal ways. So it's a really interesting book, and I really like the way it's written. Again, I'm not sure if it necessarily sits alongside all of my favourites with that, but I don't know, I feel like I need more time to sit and reflect on it, and I will do for the 1973 Booker Prize shortlist book video, so that'll be coming. Anyway, a couple of other quick ones then as well. So one other Booker Prize shortlisted book, which is from the 1974 Booker Prize shortlist. As you can see, I was falling into a bit of a theme and a bit of a time here, and that is Ending Up by Kingsley Amis. It's a bit snarky in parts, but it is largely around these characters in a retirement home, and so you've got lots of old characters who can't hear each other. A lot of the humour is sort of predicated on characters not really being able to hear each other, having memory loss, sort of farting all over the place. In some ways it feels quite childish, but there are some genuinely very funny moments. It's very snarky as well, and I think he does a lot of really fun, interesting things with it. It really zips along as well. It's a very, very short read in some ways, just under 200 pages, but it also feels a lot shorter because it really just flies through, and then it has quite a brutal ending. So I don't know, some interesting stuff there. Anyway, then a few other books that I really want to talk about, and I realise I am rambling a lot in this video. There are lots and lots of, this is just a good, like, I realised there were like 28 books from last month, and I zipped through a few of them because they weren't that interesting. With this, there were loads of books that I read that I absolutely adored, so it's a bit longer. So Queer, which is a collection of LGBTQ writing from ancient times to yesterday, by Frank Wynne is the editor, and I adored a lot of the excerpts that are in this. It really covers the full gamut. We've got some, you know, ancient Roman and Greek bits, you know, kind of passages, some poems, essays, bits of stories, short stories, you know, the whole gamut. And it covers a lot of books and writers from really across the world, and from a wide range of identities within the LGBTQ spectrum. My only real issue with it is, although there were some absolutely phenomenal passages that I adored, sometimes it felt really quite patchy, in the sense that you'd have, you know, 30 pages from, you know, taken from a novel by one author, and then you'd have one Walt Whitman poem that's you know, about 2 pages long, and that sometimes felt quite jarring for me, because, you know, you'd kind of just get really excited and get started with these brilliant poems and brilliant short stories, and then you'd kind of have that, and sometimes it wasn't really clear if what you were reading was an excerpt of a short story, or of a novel, or a whole short story. You weren't quite sure if you needed to read up any more follow-up from it. That all said, there are tons and tons of really good books and authors captured within this, and I think Frank Wynne has done a really good job of finding a really wide range of voices. You know, you've got people from, you know, Juno Dawson, you sort of British, often young adult writer, who's trans, and you've got, you know, ancient Roman poetry. You've got bits from like Sappho. You've got, you know, 18th century texts from Japan. You know, you've got this really wide range of things, and I think it was very well curated. I just had a couple of issues with maybe what was always in it, but I think overall this is really worth it. I think also I was reading to a bit of a deadline because I needed to get it back to the library online, so maybe that affected my feeling with it. Maybe it's a book that you spend a little bit longer with, and, you know, maybe read one a day and, you know, go through it like that. But anyway, a really great range of authors, and I think very, very exciting. And finally, before this ends up becoming horrendously long, I want to just talk about a few other ones. So I mentioned this in my LGBTQ plus History Month video, but Gay Bar by Jeremy Atherton Lin, which is a really, I think, just fantastic book, where Jeremy, can I call him Jeremy like that? I don't know, does that sound a bit personal? Jeremy Atherton Lin talks about his experiences with going to gay bars, and in kind of doing so, it really blends the sort of personal, the political, the historical, and so you get this kind of history of LGBTQ nightlife and LGBTQ life generally, interwoven with his own stories about various bars and how some bars were sort of centers of queer community, and about how some bars were where people met to then kind of be activists, you know, where they would kind of meet, find that they weren't alone, and then would fight for rights. And then it's also just sort of, you know, full of his stories of, you know, going to sort of sleazy back rooms, and just, you know, living his best life. So it's a really, there's something for everyone, although perhaps not particularly family friendly. But I thought this was so well done. And I am really excited to see kind of, again, any other writing by him. I just think this does some really fun and exciting things of blending together what it means to be a queer person, in the sense that our lives are, and our kind of identities are automatically made political by the fact that there are rights that need to be fought for. But also, in amongst that, we want to have fun and we want to live life to the fullest. And I think he really captures the full kind of gamut of that kind of queer experience within that, which I think is just so brilliantly done. Next, by an author who I adore and probably needs very little introduction, Virginia Woolf. And this is just a short essay called How Should One Read a Book? Which seems fitting for this. Like, where has this been all my life? But this is just a really lovely short essay where she talks about, you know, the power of reading, and how reading as a writer and writing as a reader can be really different experiences from just reading as a reader. And I know that sounds really silly, and like being a writer is like a big capital W experience, but I think what's really powerful about it is that just the way it talks about the joy that can be had with reading, but also how being a reader involves not only the pleasure aspect, but you work for it, you search for meaning, you are digging to find some of the little clues that the author has left for you in some books. So I just thought it was really nice. And there's an introduction by Sheila Heti, which I really enjoyed, which I was pleasantly surprised by, because I hated her book Motherhood, and I was a bit nervous reading it, knowing that it would be Sheila Heti. I don't know what it is. I've read essays of hers and adored them and thought they were really interesting, really poignant, really funny. Read Motherhood by her, hated it. So I don't know, maybe it's just, maybe that book wasn't for me. I don't know. Anyway, then a couple of quick other ones. So Vesper Flight by Helen MacDonald, which is a beautiful, beautiful book, where she just goes, it's a sort of a series of mini essays, sort of personal essays, where she talks about a really wide range of topics to do with nature. So from immigration and the idea of British nature, you know, and it not crossing borders, and you know how wars were fought over the idea of protecting one's nature, to, you know, just kind of her fascination with certain creatures, watching them fly above her in the sky. And it's just, I think she really does well at capturing the absolute magic of nature. I mean, I think especially in a year that we've just had, and that we're kind of still living in 2021, I think we've all come to realize just how important nature is to us all. It's a really, I think, a really evocative book about just how brilliant and powerful nature is. Then a couple of quick other ones. I'm going to do a separate video on this book because I could talk about it for ages, but I read this in one very, very hungry gulp, and that is Maxwell's Demon by Stephen Hall. Completely forgot his name there. I literally have this book here. I'm going to talk about it a little bit in a separate video as well, but I was really blown away by this because it's a very experimental book in a lot of ways. It does some really creative, clever things with the way that the text is presented on the page. Occasionally text, almost like, you know, lines and paragraphs almost completely break down, and we just get some really other exciting things. But at the same time, you've got, you know, for example, towards the end of the book, at one point the pages do this, which is sort of a zoomed in version of the previous page, which is like this. And what's really exciting is that kind of mirrors some of the things we're seeing in the text, where you might sort of notice I've got loads of little cards that I've just put in here to mark things that I really want to talk about with it because it's just so special. But, you know, we get this idea of these sort of, at first it sounds like it shouldn't work. Like, you've got these theories around physics and around energy and matter. You've got theories around origins of certain words and language that then relate to the nativity scene and whether oxen should be there at all, which seems a bit bizarre, but it kind of makes sense in the book. And then you go on to all of these other bits of story with characters existing or not quite existing, and this is all with an author as one of the main characters, and he is unable at points to work out what is fiction and what is real. And I think what really made the difference for me with this and some other experimental books is there was a lot of heart and a lot of story and plotting behind it. So sometimes the danger with experimental books is it can feel like, ha ha ha, this is really clever, but you actually don't care about the story. So you don't, it's kind of like, okay, this is clever, and so what? Okay, like, could this have been an essay? You know, I think what's really clever and beautiful about this book, and firstly, I mean, like, how gorgeous is this cover, by the way, as well? I think even more beautiful, actually, as well, interestingly, if you take off the front bit, and that's just beautiful. Anyway, and this little beautiful stuff. Anyway, this is very much a book that I think you want to have in your hands as well. Like, it's very physical. Like, it's got lots of things that are happening on the page that I kind of can't imagine working in a Kindle version, unfortunately. But yeah, anyway, so I adored his book, Rorschach Texts, and I was really excited to read this as well, and I was not disappointed. He does such playful, interesting things with the form of the novel and the form of the page, but then does all these other brilliant things, talking about, you know, the nature of what literature and writing is, about how you read. There's at one point this absolutely brilliant moment where he kind of plays with your mind a little bit, because he has one of the characters talk about how many times the letter A has been used in the book so far, and sort of says that it's something like I can't remember the exact thing, but 8.1, it's got 3 decimals, % of the book so far has been the letter A. And I just love the idea of Stephen Hall writing this and kind of having, like, quickly being like, okay, pause, like, let's go back, let's see how many letter A's are used. And then, like, surely that must have played havoc when it came to editing the book as well. Like, okay, we can't actually edit that bit because that has a letter A in it. And, like, I can't let you take that letter A out, or move around any of the other letters, because that will change the percentage. Anyway, I loved this, and I was so surprised. I'd been really struggling to kind of get my mind focused on another book I was reading, and I just thought, I knew that this was a bit more playful, and just thought I'll read 50 pages of this, then go to bed, and I ended up reading all 300 and whatever pages in just one really greedy gulp. I just absolutely fell in love with it. It's really, there's a really fascinating story. There are lots of sort of bait and switch moments, and I just think it's really cleverly done. And yeah, like I was saying, I think the danger with experimental books is often that it can feel like, so what, and it can feel like someone is just sort of being like, I am really clever, all the way through, and I never got that sense of smugness from the author in this or in Rorschach texts. Instead, it's, here is a great story that I am telling you. It's a really fun and interesting story. I'm going to pepper in these little things that I find interesting that will have some relevance later. But you can also just read this book and let it wash over you and not think too hard about the other stuff. I mean, it pays, I think, to do the work in some ways and think about some of these things cleverly and in detail. But I also think you can just sit back and let this book wash over you. And I'm really excited to eventually reread this book at a fairly normal pace, not kind of all in one go, and see what other gems I might have missed within it as well. So absolutely brilliant, and I'm really glad I read it. And then two final books just to round off and take me to a nice even 50, which is oddly satisfying. So the first is Dearly, which is a collection, I said that really weirdly, is Dearly, a collection of poems by Margaret Atwood. I adore Margaret Atwood. I will read pretty much anything she's ever written if I can get my hands on it, whether it's essays or poems or short stories or novels. I think she's incredible. The only bum note I think I've ever had with her is The Testaments, and even then I enjoyed it as a book. I just thought it could have been a lot better, or like I didn't necessarily like the plotting or the characters perhaps, but I could never deny her writing ability within that. Like, she is just an absolute force of nature when it comes to knowing exactly what words need to follow each other or exactly what descriptions make sense in a certain area. I adore her. And Dearly, I listened to it as an audiobook, and what's really beautiful is it's read by Margaret Atwood herself. All other things aside, I have a weird fascination with her voice. There's something so like almost sarcastic and droll about it at times, and really kind of sardonic. Her giving these like big addresses. I even actually remember hearing a speech that she gave in like the 70s, where she was talking about gay rights, I think it was, or at least that was a part of the speech. And there's something so kind of droll, like so darkly funny about everything she says and the way she says it, that I adored it anyway. But this collection of poems is almost far from that in some ways. It's so sad, it's so tinged with grief, although there are these really beautiful, touching moments of humor and warmth. But she speaks a lot about death, whether that's, you know, the death of traditions, the death of certain words, nature and sort of environmental collapse, or nature. You know, at one point there's this this whole sort of poem or set of kind of mini poems about a wolf, or about wolves more generally, you know, which are really interesting kind of mythical. They're not mythical, but there are loads of myths about them, and she does a really great job of digging into, you know, the real kind of difficulties of behind that. So, you know, for example, the idea that wolves have no doctors, you know, sort of naturally. So if a wolf breaks a paw, or you know, it breaks a leg or something, no one's there to look after them. You know, the other wolves will leave it for dead. And there's just something so poignant about all of the poems in this collection for me, and I was just really taken away by them. I mean, I think I was always going to be ready to enjoy it quite a lot because it's Margaret Atwood, but I just found this stunning, and I see what a lot of the buzz was about last year when this book came out. It's stunning, and I think it's really quite heartbreaking as well. You know, you've got, you know, Margaret Atwood, a woman who is in her 80s, talking quite a lot about death, which is, you know, really scary. We protect her at all costs, but it's just so poignant. It didn't feel needlessly tragic. It felt like she looked death in the face and found really beautiful moments to take from it, or at least made peace with aspects of it. and try to understand it. And I just think it was a really beautiful piece of work. And finally, something very, very different indeed. That is The Mezzanine. I've actually got my copy here, by Nicholson Baker, which is a really experimental book and a really silly and funny idea in some ways. The whole book of about 140 or so pages takes place during the character riding an escalator from the ground floor to the mezzanine, which I thought was like really silly and stupid in some ways anyway. But the more I was thinking about it, the fact that it's the mezzanine, it's not even like the top floor or whatever where there's like a long amount of space. It's literally to a half kind of floor, right? In the meantime, the character just keeps on going off on these really long tangents. There are these footnotes throughout as well. So for example, the character might say something about it'll be, you know, these really rambly kind of things. So the character will have something in his bag, and then he'll reflect on having gone to the shop to get the things that are in his bag. And you know, one of those things is a replacement shoelace because his shoelaces are broken. Then he starts rambling about how when he was a kid, he learned how to tie his own shoelaces, and that felt like a really important moment of adulthood for him. And then as well as that, he'll talk about how these two shoelaces broke within 2 days of each other. And so he then is sort of thinking, well, this is fascinating. Does this mean that actually, you know, the wear and tear that I've given my shoelaces, my left and right shoelaces over time, is roughly equal then for them to break within 2 days of each other. But that also means that the one that did break earlier had a tiny bit more tension. Why is that? Why is the left one getting more than the right? And it just goes off on these really silly tangents, which in some ways sounds like it would be really infuriating. And I suppose in some ways that's almost the point, that we're kind of like, get to the point, which is probably what some of you are saying during this video. But I just thought this was really well done, and so silly, and such an outrageous idea. And I think it kind of works for me, because it is so committed to this idea, and it's not needlessly wasting time. I mean, it kind of is, but it's that's the point, right? It's not it's kind of trying to bring you along for the ride and trying to make that funny. It's not just, here is 100 pages for the sake of it. You know, sometimes as well, the footnotes will go over several pages, so you have to make a decision about whether you immediately follow the footnote and follow it all the way through, or whether you finish reading the page you're on, then go back to the footnote and read through there. So yeah, it's really silly and very experimental, and I'm going to do a separate video where I talk about more experimental books as well. But really fun, and bit of a weird way to end the month's reading, but there we go. I really enjoyed it nonetheless. So those have been all of my reads so far from this month, and I've had a really great month of February in terms of reading. Thank you for asking. I think I've just been very lucky, I think, to pick up some books that I absolutely adored. I think it's actually probably helped that the weather's been a little bit nicer, so I've been running and out a bit more, and that's probably also meant that when I am reading, it's felt a little bit like I have a choice, that I'm actively choosing to sit down with a book, as opposed to, oh great, I've got another 3 hours to fill before I should go to bed, which is not always the case, but you know. But I think I've also just been very lucky that some absolute gems of books have been in my life this month, and I really do encourage you to check them out if they sound like your kind of thing. But if nothing else, I hope you really enjoy those. Take care and enjoy your reading, and I hope that you've also had a great month of February, in terms of reading and in terms of life, and roll on March. Let's hope it's a good one. Take care, everybody. Enjoy yourselves and look after yourselves. Bye bye.